Okay, well, thank you very much for asking me to participate in this day. I hope you are all well and holding up okay at this difficult time. Of course, when I was asked several months ago to participate, the world was quite a different place. I don't want to dwell on COVID-19 per se. There's lots of conversations going on about that, of course, and that's not directly what I've been asked to talk about. But of course, what we've been going through these past few months, wherever you are, and will continue to go through, no doubt, has thrown up a lot of issues that are relevant to our interests today. So it would be odd if it wasn't mentioned or wasn't at the forefront of our minds. And of course, out of this, some interesting things have been popping up, just a few there on my first slide, about some potential interesting moves towards a more degrowth perspective, not only in terms of where we put interventions and money in the future, but also in terms of our own individual practices. But there's a lot of unknowns, a lot of speculations about where this might go. So obviously what we don't want to do today is to spend time sort of staring into a crystal ball and trying to work out where it's all going. But the reason I start with that is that for me, this is all thrown up stuff that builds upon past and ongoing work around citizens' roles in and responses to the many practices that are bundled together under the broad headline of the circular economy. And the reason I did mention COVID-19 is that I found, and I have been finding, there are some resonances in the roles ascribed to us, or the roles being taken up by citizens during this current crisis, and some of those ascribed to us under the circular economy. What I want to do in this brief talk is think through some of those resonances and what they might suggest. And the sort of critical scrutiny I and many others have been arguing for around the circular economy project. So just to explain a little bit, I'm a social researcher. I have degrees, excuse me, I also have a cough, degrees in anthropology and geography. And I've been looking at issues of sustainable consumption for many years, trying really to take a closer look at some of the assumptions about, for example, pro-environmental behaviour interventions, where the environment sort of sits within our sort of psyche, if you like, and why so many exhortations for us to care about the environment don't go that well. And about 8 years ago, I was working on a project on electronic waste and mobile phones. So started to look into the circular economy. And a lot's happened since then. You could almost say the concept has had a meteoric rise in terms of its uptake by key institutions. It's become quite a guiding discourse, for example, the European Commission, as I'm sure many of you are acutely aware of. We could say a lot about that. There is certainly debate about how its mainstreaming can certainly be read as yet another iteration of a pro-growth strategy that is one of the many discourses that we've seen in the last 30 years or so since sustainable development became part of our common parlance. I don't disagree with that. I think there's a lot to be said, and I think we'll come full circle when I finish off in about 20 minutes or so to that point. Where I want to start, though, is to pick at the thread of that a bit. And from the basic observation that I started to make when I was looking at the circular economy about 8 years ago, is that when it becomes mainstream, it has also been rendered a very under-socialized concept. By that, I mean it's rehearsing a very simplistic rendition of the citizen and how social change happens. So if I go to the next slide, some of you will be very familiar with that, excuse me. That is the Ellen MacArthur Foundation butterfly diagram of the circular economy that's been used a lot in recent years. And if you look at that, you'll see that all circles and loops lead to the consumer and the user. And quite a few of us have been writing about that, is that given the position of the human subject in the circular economy, you would think there'd been quite a lot of sociological development of it since it started, well, from many fields, from industrial design, industrial ecology and design per se, for the consumer and the user now to be the central focus, you would hope there would be some development. But when you look at the iterations, the mainstream iterations of the circular economy, that certainly doesn't seem to be the case. And why that's a problem, I would say quite clearly, is that I would argue that that underdevelopment puts the entire circular economy project at considerable risk, not only from failing, but also from potentially doing more environmental damage than it necessarily intends to. So that's a very bold statement, I know, but let's think about that. So my interest has usually been from looking at the perspective of the citizen consumer and the more sort of practice-based interventions. So, as I'm sure many of you know, there are 101 different ways that we are all excuse me, implicated in the circular economy. Where we get our energy from, how we use the energy, how, where and what we purchase as both essential and non-essential items. And indeed what essential and non-essential means in the here and now. So if I go to my next slide, this is the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's Resolve framework. I'm sorry, I'm coughing. I have actually probably had coronavirus and I'm still in recovering. So it's left me with a bit of a cough, so I can only apologise. So you can see some from the Resolve framework. This is their attempt to kind of encapsulate the things that need to happen. So beyond the butterfly diagram, these are kind of the more substantive actions that we need to take. And there's a lot in there. But if you start to break it apart a little bit, you'll see from the perspective of a consumer as a citizen, we have kind of two roles, basic roles ascribed to us. And one that is to use goods and services that are already more sustainable without necessarily changing what we consume and why. So you buy a different car or you buy coffee that has less packaging. So somebody else is kind of doing the work for us and we just carry on, but we choose differently. On top of that, there's also this idea that we will all change our practices. So how we consume, not necessarily what, but how. And that is through the idea of sharing and renting rather than owning goods. So for the former, for the one where somebody else is doing the work and we're buying best packaging, etc., this is about offering products that appeal to the consumer within the norms of the current market. That's a big issue. A big problem, I think, and if it wasn't a problem, we've had 20, 30 years of labelling and sustainable consumption interventions, and here we are. So we have to automatically assume that assuming the market will take care of it is a problem. But for now, I want to focus on the sharing and the renting and the sort of the social economy, the sharing economy aspect of it. If you look at the Resolve framework, you'll see a number of companies, etc., labelled there. You've got streaming services, car sharing, Airbnb. And if we think about this as a form of exchange, from my own research and research other people have been doing, when you look at the sort of mainstream iterations of the circular economy from these perspectives, all of these kind of practices are framed very much as nothing but a considerable boon to the consumer. So there is this sort of casual valorization and glorification of these kinds of practices. And of course, we can say there is some truth in that. You can now stream a movie instead of having to traipse down to the video shop and pick one and then go home in your car and then realize it's not a good film and then go back again. Sure, that's happened. You can forego the costs of buying a power tool that you only use once or twice by renting it. And you can feel good about things if you become an active part of your community, say you give up your Sunday to help at a repair cafe. Nobody is disputing that, certainly not disputing that. But my question is, what are we missing from that story? And I and others have argued, well, actually, potentially quite a lot. And really, possibly, some of the most important parts are missing if we do really mean business about the circular economy. For one, there's the issue, for me, of choice. As with some of the local mutual aid and sharing, sorry, that's arisen in response to COVID-19. Some of these practices are really about being entangled in circumstances and systems that mean actually this choice is spurious or at least patchy. So this idea that we're all sort of taking on these sharing practices as some kind of, you know, heroic intervention for the good of the community is problematic if we start to think about, well, what are the choices being made here? How do people feel that they have a choice? So for example, if we take Airbnb, and I know that's kind of like sort of the lowest hanging fruit because it's been subject to quite a lot of criticism. We look at that for a minute. A lot of the very early marketing, and certainly some of the sort of YouTube, Brian Chesky's sort of YouTube sort of speeches about Airbnb have very much been using the language of hosts as heroes, as people very much wanting to communicate with people from other places. And that's great, and I'm not saying that hasn't happened. But of course, when you start to look at who these hosts are, a considerable number of them are part of what we might call the precariat, i.e. people who have very limited sort of assets that they can commodify and make money from. And it's kind of more of a lifeline than anything else. So there are kind of stories being told around these really important practices that don't necessarily bear fruit to critical scrutiny. And of course, we know that when something that has the best intentions becomes mass commodified through time, it becomes problematic in terms of where that money goes. But what I want to focus on also is another issue. It's about when we look at the practices that we are all ascribed under the circular economy, we don't really ask what the costs are. And by that, yes, I mean financial money, but also labour, also opportunity. When I started looking into this, and many other people have too, the question of who bears those costs the most, in what way, it's very hard to address or find any information about that. And also the idea of impacts and knock-on effects is a common problem. You know, we talk about rebound effects as direct and indirect. That is a big potential problem with taking up these new practices under the circular economy. So where this is going is using the idea of consumption work to look at the circular economy from a practice perspective. So this concept comes from the sociology writings of Mariam Glucksmann and Katie Wheeler. And what they're talking about is the unaccounted for labour that goes into domestic practices. So there on that slide on my left, you will see their book, which is about, as it says, household recycling and consumption work. So it is basically saying that we assume that the sort of all these sort of commodity chains are outside the house, and when stuff gets into the house, that's a private realm. But really, the kind of circuits of monetary exchange and material exchange are reliant upon this labour that happens in the house. So we wouldn't have a market in recycled products if people weren't recycling. Now, this isn't to say we shouldn't be recycling. No one's saying that we shouldn't have to do anything. It's more about an empirical question of how is this happening and what are the implications in terms of how far one can actually adopt lots of new practices. So it's not a moral or a normative evaluation of labour. It's a sort of empirical, sociological one from our perspective. So if we think about all the different platforms and types of renting and sharing, for example, the other side of that slide there's loads of different ways, loads of different platforms, lots of different objects and product service systems through which you can participate in a form of sharing. There's a lot there that is currently unaccounted for, and potentially new forms of consumption work going on here. As I say, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. And one of the things that really interests me is, of course, why do proponents of the circular economy assume that all of this leads to some automatic environmental good, when, for example, it could be adding new streams of consumption onto existing ones? So, for example, if you take clothes rental, high-end clothes rental, there is some evidence to suggest that actually this is on top of ongoing fast fashion. So it's not that, okay, I won't buy that, I'll rent it. It's like, okay, well, I can buy that and I can rent that really nice dress that I couldn't afford anyway, and I'll wear it once, then send it back. So the concept of displacement is really, really important, both from an environmental accounting perspective, but also from a sociological human perspective as well. So there's a lot we don't know, which is fine, but there's a lot that's being assumed about how we will all be willing and able to participate in the circular economy as citizens and consumers. So that's, if I go on to the next slide, that's been chopped off at the top a little bit here actually. So this is work that I've started with Dan Welsh, Helen Holmes, and Harold Weiser, who were at Manchester University, and Katie Wheeler, who's at Essex University, thinking about what consumption work as a lens can bring to these really critical empirical questions of the circular economy. So we have that short piece there that just lays out the agenda in Discover Society, and I've put the URL on the slide that you can all have a look at it. And what we're trying to do here is find ways to think constructively about a less valorized and sort of heroic story of the citizen consumer under the circular economy, and one that asks those empirical questions about the capacity for us to embody that kind of sort of trope that we've all been handed down. And so to me, that speaks to a central problem to the circular economy. It is arguably aiming to hold constant two very well-trodden and critiqued and well-worn assumptions. That is of consumer sovereignty, and that is of renting and sharing is a sociological and environmental automatic good. It's trying to hold those constant. It doesn't really question those, whilst suggesting we can bring about profound radical transition in socio-material relations. Now we have to ask, is that possible? Do we really think, given the past patterns of practices and successes and failures here, that carrying on with those overarching frames as a point of reference, whilst trying to really engender some quite radical changes in terms of how we see materials and how we interact with them, whether that's possible? You'll have noticed in the circular economy, there's very little talk of demand reduction. And I think there's a real threat to the entire project when it tries to beat markets at its own game. So I want to give you an example now from that project on mobile phones. I'm sort of trying to sort of come towards the end a little bit here because I'm mindful I don't have much time. So when I was working on this project about mobile phones and e-waste, we were coming up with a new kind of idea about how you actually can get the electronic waste out of phones. So we looked at the feasibility of a different product service system wherein the consumer owns the skin, the outside bit, we called it a skin, which you can customize, but you rent the working parts, the inside, what we called the skeleton and the guts. So it's returned regularly for recycling rather than hibernated or thrown away, as often happens with electronic waste now. So of course we asked consumers what they thought of this product service system. Would you be interested? Would it work, etc.? And of course many liked the idea, but many were not happy to do the work involved. So basically we were saying, like, once a year you'd have to take the phone back and wait and then be without your phone and have it recycled, and then it would have to be calibrated. So it's effort, not major, but it certainly was work. And basically a lot of the response was, well, if it doesn't outcompete existing phones in terms of cost or whatever service, why would I bother? But what is interesting is if you leave the story there, if you stop there, which some of the research into product service system tends to, It makes us all sound a bit lazy and disinterested. I'm sure some of us are, that's fine. But I think we need to go a little bit further and deeper when we think about this. And to me, the most interesting thing that came out of this is this object really is, this work was set in the context where some felt they could not go without their phone or take the risks that a new product service system would entail. Even if those risks are minor, even if the work isn't that much, it's still asking something more. In a context where this thing, this phone, has become so central to many people's existence. So really, it's not about the object per se, it's not about the phone. The ability or the willingness of consumers to swap out one phone or business model for another wasn't really the point. It was about the networks of relationships, the norms and the expectations that have grown up around the phone, what that phone embodies. So we have this expectation of seamless connectivity and data security, which many feel are non-negotiable. So many express feelings, many of our interviewees express feelings that they didn't have much choice, but to participate in having a phone, and they had to hold on to this phone. And that these expectations, which they felt a little bit resentful to, already took enough out of them. So don't ask me to do anything else because I'm already doing what I can. So it's not about the product service system per se. It's about where that product positions us in terms of feeling we have volition in our own lives. Feeling that we can choose not to choose, which many of our participants, our interviewees, felt they could not actually do when it came to their mobile phone in terms of having or using it. So you can come to the conclusion from that actually it's not about making a phone bigger, brighter, faster, stronger, whatever. It's actually about questioning what we've all done to each other and ourselves by the expectation of that connectivity, and how we begin to have that sort of rolling back, if you like, of that, or the ability of people to feel that they can safely opt out of that. And that's a massive conversation, obviously. But this is what we're talking about today, isn't it? These kind of degrowth conversations, these conversations where people feel they have a choice not to get caught up in these hyper sort of consumption models. So I'm probably running out of time, so I'm just going to round it up there. So where does that leave us? Trying to cover a lot of ground in a very short period of time. But to me, this underscores quite a few things. Yes, the model of the consumer or the user underpinning the circular economy does support the arguments for it as another green growth iteration rather than a degrowth approach. But I don't think that then means we throw up our hands and say, oh, well, they've done it again. They've co-opted a good idea. We'll just, sit back here and criticize. Mine and others' work suggests that, we will keep on failing to have much of an impact until these norms and expectations around consumption become part of the debate. And I think that's why days like this or half days like this are very interesting, because that's part of the conversations that we're having. And I'm optimistic that actually, even though we've had 30 years of what we can sort of summarize as sort of failed interventions around trying to change consumption, the game has changed, whether that be climate change and COVID-19 or both together. Of course, they're inextricably linked. But I do feel that the more pressing these agendas are now, the more we have capacity to intervene with the more sort of radical suggestions, and there's that kind of political will now to hear them. But I think to do that, we need to be critically aware and have a balanced view of where things like the sharing economy fits in, and who pays the cost for that in terms of time, labour and issues of equity. If we go in or carry on with a kind of valorised, romanticised view of these changing user consumer practices, then I think that we won't be doing ourselves or the circular economy as a potentially positive project any favours in the future. So of course, hopefully, I hope that sparked some debate and we'll have some good questions and conversations. And for those of you who want to follow up, that's my email. and you can access my papers there, drop me a line, and hopefully I will get to communicate with some of you directly soon. So thanks very much for listening. I appreciate your time, and hopefully we'll all meet in person at some point in the future. Thanks.